What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Dark Patterns. You guys love the story we did about the villain that just Batman couldn't beat. Well, this story is amazing. So this opens up with a cop being thrown out of a building. And at that point, it just kind of picks up with Dr. Sarika examining everything. Now again, Dr. Sarika was introduced in the last video. He's the newest medical examiner, although definitely a drunk and a little bit jaded. But we're told Officer Peterson's wrists and neck showed elevated histamine levels, but there were none around the impact wounds from the ground. That he was strung up like a puppet when he was still alive, but he was dead by the time he went out the window. And so that's what we're told. Bleeden Towers is scheduled for demolition. Roughly half the residents have refused to go, despite the generous resettlement packages they were offered by the city. That they've lived on this block for generations. They don't want their homes being torn down to be replaced by luxury condos, which makes sense. But as Batman says all of this, right, Commissioner Gordon asks, right, but now they're killing cops? And Batman just says, so go in, right, arrest those people who are responsible. Why am I here? And Gordon tells him, the thing is, Peterson didn't go in alone. And that's where Batman realizes they have a hostage. And Gordon just says, his partner Price, the entrance is barricaded from the inside. The message is clear. No cops. And if we do try and go in, we risk starting a war. Good people live there too, but Bleeden has long been a hive of gang activity, and they have the high ground. And so that's where Batman's just like, okay, there's an opening on the 5th floor. And when he gets in there, things get pretty crazy pretty fast, because the whole building almost kind of feels like a maze. Various apartments have fallen into a state of disrepair. It's kind of nuts, but Batman hears some of these guys talking. Right? Did you hear me? I said the boss says if we gotta wait much later, he's gonna escalate things. And another guy is just kind of like, escalate things, right? He already threw one cop out the window. And that's where Batman kind of fills us in, right? He says Bleeden Towers was designed as public housing post-war. Now it stands as a relic of an age where it seemed as though those down on their luck might actually be provided for by the state. It consists of 215 apartments over 12 floors. The missing cop might be held in any one of them. And the guys continue talking, right? I heard that pigs have wings. Maybe the second one will fly. But Batman says here, the quickest way to find her will be to put the fear of God in those who took her. And so Batman literally busts in and it's just like, where is she? But there's no one in the hallway. And one of the guys is like, did you hear that? And it's like, oh my God, it's Batman. But that's where they say, like, I don't think he sees us. And they call him out, right? This is Bleeden Towers. You don't know this place. You don't know how it works. And so as Batman's kind of like jumping up to various floors, trying to find his way through here, there's a guy in an apartment who looks really, really shady, who just says, it's the architecture, right? He says it bounces sound around. Things seem like they're coming from somewhere that they're not. I keep out of it all, but I don't want to go either. And it's not right taking that cop. And Batman asks, right, where do they take her? And the guy just says, I don't know. Maybe you should listen for her and you'll hear her. But that doesn't mean that you will find her easy either. It's creepy. It's really, really creepy. And in fact, there's a whole mythology that surrounds this. And we'll talk about that as we kind of get further into this. But that's when you switch over to a guy named Rickson and his wife. And Rickson is seemingly the guy running the whole thing, right? He says, the one thing I asked you to do, and I can still hear her whining through that gag. And his wife is just kind of like, please, Rickson, right? I don't hear anything, right? I think that she's asleep. But you find out pretty quickly, Rickson is exceedingly abusive, right? Both physically, verbally, and even emotionally, right? He says, everything I do for you, and you disrespect me in my own home, and she was like, well, I didn't really mean to. And he says, but that's the problem, is that you never think. You're just a very stupid woman who doesn't deserve love. And that's where these henchmen come running in, right? They're just like, the Batman's here, right? And at that point, he's just kind of like, what? And it's like, you got to tell the boss, right? He has to know. And Rickson's like, okay, right? The boss is right here. He can hear everything. And we find out it's Scarface, right? And he says, I'm not happy one get. Now, here's the thing to know about Scarface, and this is why things get really interesting here. Scarface is almost kind of like this mythological character within DC Comics. So for those of you guys who are familiar with Scarface, Scarface speaks a certain way. He cannot pronounce the word B, but there's almost this kind of mythology around Scarface. And you'll see what I'm talking about as we get further into this, because I don't want to spoil anything for people who are not familiar with this character. But it's really, really cool, right? It's one of the coolest things about Scarface as a Batman villain in DC Comics. But at that point, Bruce calls up Sarika, right? And he says, I need more information. Are you sober? And Sarika's just kind of like, I mean, I'm sober enough. And so Batman's just kind of like, Bleeden Towers, right? I'm having difficulty navigating it. Tell me about the body, beyond the obvious. And Sarika just says, like, you want to know about the impact wounds, whether I can tell you how high this poor soul fell from, which floor. And he just says, the thing is, terminal velocity height for the human body is generally lower than people expect. We can see the same damage in a body that's fallen 30 feet as a body that's fallen out of a plane. Having said that, there's evidence of multiple post-mortem impacts, if you understand what I mean. And Batman's just like, when he hit the ground, he bounced. So assuming they're holding his partner in the same place that they threw him from, I'd say you could rule out the lower 5 floors. So that right there gives Batman a good starting point. The problem is that as he makes his way through the building, suddenly he's met by Scarface and the person that controls him. And that's where Batman is just like Wesker, right? He says, it sounds like Albert Wesker. Now, that's a complete and total misspelling. It's actually Arnold Wesker, because Arnold Wesker is the guy who historically controls Scarface. And Batman fills it in to a degree, right? He says, a meek ventriloquist who had a breakdown and began manifesting a violent personality through his mannequin, a gangster puppet he called Scarface. I prevented him from committing a triple homicide by smashing the doll, inducing a panic attack. But this man, and then he grabs him and slams him to the ground, and he just says, you are not Wesker. Now, here's the crazy mythology that surrounds Scarface in DC Comics. It's not really clear whether Scarface is real or not. It's almost a little weird, right? It's one of these really, really, really weird things. 9 times out of 10, it's Wesker controlling the Scarface puppet. And Wesker, quite literally, as Batman said, he just kind of channels that personality of like violence, right? Trying to get back in the world, that he channels it through the puppet, right? The puppet is the way in which he's able to exercise what he considers to be some measure of control over a world that was otherwise just exceedingly harsh and abusive to him. But there have been instances in DC Comics where Scarface moves of his own accord. It's like a Chucky doll, right? It's really weird and it's really creepy. So over the course of the rest of this, I actually invite you to ask yourself the question, is the Scarface puppet moving on his own and talking by himself? That's the crazy thing. Specifically, in that moment, when the puppet's sitting down on the ground and he says, and I'm not one bit happy, nobody was controlling him, right? So that's kind of the crazy thing. So at that point, Batman just says, speak, right? Who are you? And Scarface stops laughing. There's no one controlling him, right? And he just says, Batman. I'm just going to say Batman instead of Gatman. But he says, Batman, did you think that you could stop me again by destroying my body? Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to show them that we mean business. And so at that point, these tenants, right, these bad guys, if you want to call them that, start pushing stuff out of the apartments and start firing down into the crowd. And that's when you realize they've basically turned the building into the face of Scarface. And Scarface just says, I have a new body now, Batman, a better one, and you are standing in it. Because he says, welcome to Scarface Towers. And the entire building is now filled with all these people wearing Scarface masks. It's very reminiscent of like Dredd, of like the Judge Dredd story. It's really, really, really dope, because now Batman's on the hunt. And actually what you do is you get a bit of a flashback here, right, where he basically confronts Arnold Wesker in the most recent occasion. And again, Arnold Wesker has Scarface, right, a bat. He's dressed as a damn bat. Why can't I hit you? And of course, that's where Batman just addresses Wesker directly, right? You're not a marksman, Wesker. You're a maniac with a puppet, right? He addresses Wesker directly because from Batman's perspective, Scarface isn't real. And again, he smashes the doll. And so of course, Wesker just kind of starts to break down into like a panic attack, right? What did you do to the boss, right? But Scarface tells him, like, I will come back with a body better than the one that I ever had. And that's where things get cool, because at that point you switch over to Gordon. And Gordon just says, after Batman brought him in, Arnold Wesker attributed all his crimes to his ventriloquist dummy. He convinced his psychiatrist the Scarface side of his personality was entirely erased when the doll was destroyed. He received early release from Arkham 6 months ago. further proof that Arkham psychiatry reports are best utilized as toilet paper. And so one of the guys asks him, right, what are our orders, Commissioner? And Gordon just says, Officer Price is still being held inside. The hostage takers have significant firepower and the high ground. Any attempt at a frontal assault is going to result in a bloody shootout and will all but guarantee they execute the hostage. And so at that point, it's just like, so we just sit around and do nothing, right? And that's where Gordon just says, Batman's inside, right? He knows what he's doing. Meanwhile, Batman's being shot at from every direction by like all these henchmen, right? It's crazy. And that's where Scarface is just like, do you think that you can hide from me, Batman? You're inside my body. You invaded me like a cancer cell, the kind the body deals with every day. It finds them and destroys them. And that's all you are in here, Batman. And then at that point, he just like busts into an apartment. There's a little girl who's sitting there. And then of course he's like, show me where your parents are, right? And then Batman of course goes and basically meets with her mom. And that's where you learn like the really creepy history around this building. Because at that point, when Batman's talking to this woman, right, she was like, you're Batman, right? You're the one on the TV running around on the roofs dressed like that and helping people. I guess it looks scary if you see it in the dark. And so she just says, right, it looks uncomfortable from where I'm sitting. Doesn't really look that scary at all. And Bruce, of course, realizes that she's sick, right? He's like, you can't stay here. The towers are under siege. You need medicine. But that's where she says, you tell that to the doctor. He says there's nothing wrong with me, even though I've been throwing up and cannot walk straight for months now, ever since that brouhaha started out there. And she just tells her daughter, Flora, right? You know, she's like, we have a guest, please get some iced tea. And Batman's just kind of like Scarface, right? Like, you've heard him before. And she says, heard him? Yeah, all night. That racket for months, telling us we're safe in his body, that he's not going to let them take the block away. And the worst of it is all of them out there. They've been listening to him. They think he's the spirit of Bleeden Towers or something. And I don't know why they think the spirit of the building would sound like a bad Al Capone impression, but that's where Bruce just says, a acousmatic sound, right? And she's like, what are you talking about? And he says, a sound where the hearer cannot see the source. It can hold power psychologically. We have a tendency to ascribe meaning to it, spiritual weight. Moses hearing the voice of God in the desert, which sounds like the greatest troll ever, right? Like just some dude in a bush that Moses can't see, talking to him and tricking him into thinking that he's hearing the voice of God, right? You know, the ancient Greeks. But jumping back in, right? Batman says the ancient Greeks, they thought every cave held the voice of the lost nymph Echo. And so she asks, like, why are we talking about Greeks? And he says, it's said that Pythagoras lectured on philosophy from behind a veil to make his arguments more powerful. And that's where Flora is just kind of like the Wizard of Oz. And Batman says, yes, just like the Wizard of Oz. And so Batman says, the people who live in this tower are already under extreme stress. Those urban myths, believing the voices of those who've lived and died here, still echo down the halls. They're going to lose their histories. And he says, then a new voice arrives, loud as thunder, telling them it will protect them if they do what it says. Arnold Wesker found this place, a melting pot of desperation and just enough belief to buy into his Scarface delusion, right? In times of desperation, people will believe what they want to believe. But that's where this woman says, they're not urban myths. She says, I've heard my dad grouching down these halls almost every Thanksgiving that I'm still drying out the turkey. Trust me, I am not hearing it because I want to. And if you're wrong about that, what if you're wrong about the rest of it? And so that's when there's a knock on the door. And they both realize that Scarface's henchmen are going door to door hunting for Batman. So of course he ends up going out the window. But the reality here is that it doesn't really work all that well because they ultimately figured out where he is. But that's the cool thing, is Batman has this conversation with Gordon, right? Where Gordon asks, like, what's going on, right? Is Wesker, like, fill me in on what's happening? And Batman just says he's taken over the entire building. He's got its residents hanging on his every word. And that's where Gordon just kind of says, right, we have to regroup. You can't fight an entire building of people. But that's where Batman says, I won't have to. If Wesker thinks the building is Scarface and that he's the one thinking for his boss, there's only one place it makes sense for him to be. That Wesker has to be in the brain. And I make that the 12th floor. And I'm going in to lobotomize Scarface. But that's where you find out that he's been caught up to. And Scarface's henchmen are like throwing everything they can at Batman out the window to knock him off the rope and send him falling to his death. Irons, lamps. I mean, imagine throwing an iron at someone. I mean, that takes some balls, right? Bags of trash. They despise this guy. But of course, Batman ends up accessing the inside of the building yet again anyway, right? He ends up on the 9th floor. He takes out one of these guys and starts jumping from floor to floor, going after all of them. Here's the crazy thing, right? Here's one of the crazy things that he says, right? He says, okay, 3 to go. And then he throws out this substance. And that's where Scarface is like, do you think smoke will affect me, Batman? I've been smoking the finest Cuban cigars since before you were born. And Batman is just like, this is white phosphorus, right? That's crazy. It's a weapon of war. Batman just committed a war crime. White phosphorus is so dangerous because it ignites when it encounters air. It doesn't require any kind of a flame or any kind of a detonator or anything. And so that's where he says, right, I figure some of these fire alarms in this building must still work, which sets the alarms off, right? It creates a kind of distraction because in this distraction, they can't hear where Batman is. The echoes make it impossible to determine where his footsteps are and where he's coming from. So of course, he overtakes these guys, gets to the 10th floor, and then starts jumping to the 11th floor, takes out more guys. He gets to the 12th floor, then he gets to Wesker, right? And he's like, Wesker, prison, now. And Wesker cannot talk because someone cut out his tongue, right? And he's just like, who did this to you, Wesker? And Wesker just says it was Scarface, right? And so at that point, you jump back to Rickson, right? And he just says, like, let me in, right? He's literally like trying to bust into the apartment with his wife. And he's like, let me in, right? The bat's causing chaos out there. Set off the alarms so we can't hear the boss. And that's where Scarface is like, you have not been listening, Rickson, right? You've outlived your usefulness. And so his wife goes to the kitchen and gets a knife and just says, Scarface, please. And Scarface says, do not be scared, sweetheart. And the whole time, right, Rickson's just like, what are you talking about, boss? And Scarface just says, just as we discussed. And so you jump back to Batman, right? He says, Wesker, Scarface is a symptom of something much like dissociative identity disorder. He's your ID manifesting itself externally. And going by this wound pattern, I don't think you did this to yourself. You taught someone else, didn't you? Did you find someone like you who you wanted to help, someone you thought needed to bring out that side of their personality? Talk to me, Wesker. Who is the voice out there? And at that point, you jump back to the wife of Rickson who killed him. And that's when you find out she's the one controlling everything. She's the one that's running the show because she's talking to Scarface and she's like, he was my husband. And Scarface just says, he hurt you, right? He couldn't protect your home. What kind of man was he? And she just says, boss, I think she's awake, right? The cop, she saw everything. And Scarface just says, well, that won't do, will it? And she says, we can't have no witnesses, Gaggy. That's the crazy thing, is because she is it. She's that person. She's the person that Wesker taught, right? And so she moves in to kill the cop. And so what ends up happening is a bunch of these henchmen show up here and they see the bodies, right? The cop is dead, Rickson's dead, and they're like, what happened here, right? And one of them's just like, the hostage, right? She was the only thing keeping the cops from coming into Scarface Towers. And that's where Gaggy just says, and you weren't here to stop the Batman getting to them both and escaping. And at that point, he's just like, Batman? Right, yeah, right. Batman doesn't do that, right? She's like, I'm sorry, Michelle. I'm sorry about your husband, and she's like, just get the bodies out of here, right? Get them out of my home. And again, Scarface is just like, what are you waiting for? Do as the lady says. So it's kind of nuts, right? It's an ingenious strategy, right? The nature of the building's structure makes it impossible to understand where a voice is coming from. Arnold Wesker, being a ventriloquist, is a master at throwing his voice. He taught that to Gaggy. So that's all she's doing, is just throwing her voice around the apartment. But they think it's coming from Scarface. It's wild. It's so cool, but it's so wild. Because at that point, you pick back up with Batman and Arnold actually shows him an old service stairwell, and they're kind of making their way through. But that's when Batman starts to put the clues together. And he's just like, you grew up here, didn't you? Right? I can see it in the way that you move here, how familiar it is to you. And he says, I'm guessing this is how you got around here when you were young. Little Arnold Wesker, a nervous child who didn't want to be noticed, able to see into people's lives, but not be seen, shielded by the walls. And later, you developed the Scarface persona, something else to hide behind that let you take out your frustrations on the world. After you were released from prison, you came back here and someone took Scarface from you, someone who thinks bigger than you, the same person who cut out your tongue. So show me where they've taken the police officer. That's where you jump to Officer Price, who's not dead. And here's the crazy part. This voice comes out of nowhere, right? She's like, oh my God, my throat. This voice is like, hello? And she just asks, right, is someone there? And the voice just keeps saying, hello. And she's like, I can't, my voice, right? Help me. I need help. And the voice says, hello again. Then you jump back to Batman, right? And it just says they moved her, right? Once they get to the apartment where she was at, it's like, she's gone. And he chimes into Gordon. He just says, right, like, I think all of this went south, that they've moved her, but where they were keeping her, there's blood residue, and there's a lot of it. And it could be more than one person. It's hard to tell. It's been scrubbed. But on the slim chance that she's not dead, she's on borrowed time. And that's where Gordon's like, then there is no more time to be dainty about this. We're coming in guns blazing. And so that's when you jump to Batman talking to Wesker, and that's where you find out that Wesker's tongue was put on ice so that it could be reattached at some point. But he wasn't the one who did it. The person who cut his tongue out was the one who did it. So clearly they care about him. And so Batman continues along. This is the apartment of a married couple, but it is not decorated the way this kind of man decorates. The furniture is old, but well cared for, sentimental, inherited. Her family had owned this apartment for at least 2 generations. So it was hers first, then he moved in, and he took it over. Not a kind man, probably a cruel one. And you saw and heard everything that happened through the walls, didn't you, Arnold? She was someone like you, pushed around, unable to protect herself. You knew Scarface could protect her, so you taught her how it worked, the skills of the ventriloquist, and she's talented, probably better than you. You hatched a plan together to prove Scarface was real. The husband probably thought the doll was a prank at first, but you have your ways of being persuasive, because they sneak the doll back into the house, and Wesker, sitting under the couch, starts throwing his voice, and then Arnold, laying under the couch, gets out and starts choking the husband. Now the husband, right, Rickson never sees who it is that's attacking him. He simply just knows that someone's trying to choke him, and then he passes out. And then at that point, they put the doll back into the apartment. And he says that's when Scarface started talking to him, right? You thought that she would use Scarface to improve her life, to stop that man pushing her around, but she used him to take over the whole building. She used him to hatch a plan against those who take her home away from her. Then when the first cop died, you begged her to run away with you, to get out of here, at which point you became the one trying to take her home away. You unleashed something in this poor woman, and it's out of control. And so that's when you pick up with Gaggy, right, whose henchmen have basically abandoned her, right? For them, like, the whole thing's over. There's no point in doing this anymore, and they don't necessarily fear Scarface. I mean, they do, but they're not really worried about, like, retribution. And so she's basically down in the cellar, right, the basement of the building, getting ready to torch the place, because Scarface tells her, right, that's it, sweetheart. Remember what the man in the hat promised, how to free the voices of the tower if all else fails. Release them in the smoke. And so once this fire breaks out and the whole building starts to get torched, that's where Batman just says, there's another fire tonight in Gotham City. The architecture of Bleeden Towers acts like a wind funnel, whipping the flame through the structure. And within minutes, the complex is a den of yelling and roaring, right? The cop is trying to get out, right? Price is trying to get out of this bathroom that she's locked in, right? People are trying to escape this building as best they can. And so, of course, Batman guides them out. And so Price, of course, smashes down one of the doors, and the voice chimes in again, right? Take a left, the stairwell. And of course, she runs into Batman, and Batman's just like, I've got you, right? He grabs her and he gets her out of there, and Wesker just kind of sits in the fire and watches all this transpire, and he sees just like this gigantic face in the fire. Batman asks, like, what are you looking at? And it's just this huge face that's out there, and that's where things get really creepy, because at that point you jump to Batman, Sarika, and Gordon talking to each other. And that's where they say, Michelle Rickson has not been identified among the bodies, at least not yet. And Batman says fire was never Scarface's MO, so why would she burn the building? And Sarika just says maybe she saw no other way out. Like, Gotham will do that to people. And Batman asks, Officer Price, and that's where Gordon's just like, she's recovering, right? It looks like even Wesker will talk again, for better or worse. And so Bruce is just kind of like, we got lucky, right? But that's where Gordon tells him, Price said there was a voice. She said a voice voice led her to you down the twisted hallways of that godforsaken place. She said it was Peterson's voice, her partner's, who's been lying here on this slab since last night. And Gordon just says, right, another ghostly voice of Bleeden Towers, perhaps. And Sarika just kind of hand waves it away, right? He's just like, oh, auditory hallucinations are a possible side effect of carbon monoxide inhalation. And Batman's just like, yes, that's all it was. And that's all that it could have been. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. I told you, it's a phenomenal story. It's an incredible story. Dark Patterns is so good. Let me know if you want me to cover the rest. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.